The air was thick with tension as Bishop Henry Fernandez's words echoed across the congregation, words that no one had expected to hear so openly. You won't believe how this moment started. He wasn't there to give another soft sermon or deliver a calm teaching. Instead, his voice carried a fire that made everyone sit up, whisper, and stare in shock. Let me tell you, his message wasn't just for the people in front of him, it was for pastors, leaders, and churches across the world. He stood tall, his tone sharp, as if every word was a sword cutting through the growing fog of fame and spectacle that had overtaken the modern church. What makes this story different was the courage it took for him to say what most leaders were too afraid to whisper. He began by talking about how churches had changed. Not long ago, pastors were known only in their small neighborhoods. They were community shepherds, not celebrities. Their lives were simple, their focus clear, and their calling pure. But this was where it got interesting. With technology, television, and later social media, a new type of pastor had emerged. One who was not just a preacher, but a brand. Cameras and lights replaced quiet pews. Designer clothes and luxury cars began to define success more than prayer and faith ever had. People no longer came just to worship, they came to be entertained. The pulpit, once a place of spiritual authority, slowly turned into a stage. Fernandez spoke with a boldness that felt like a heavy strike against this growing trend. He reminded everyone how this culture had been building for decades, how televangelists in the 1980s filled stadiums and became household names. But now, pastors weren't just filling stadiums, they were building empires. Instagram and TikTok turned them into influencers, with followers admiring their perfect lifestyles more than their sermons. This is how the church lost its focus, he said, with a tone that silenced the room. He pointed out that it wasn't the gospel people were following anymore, it was personalities. And while many celebrated this as a sign of growth, Fernandez warned that it was a dangerous shift away from God's mission. But here's the shocking part. He wasn't just making general statements. His words felt sharp, like arrows aimed at certain well-known names in the church world. He didn't need to call them out. The descriptions were clear. Everyone listening had a pastor in mind, a leader who fit this picture perfectly. And that was what made the tension so thick. Was he talking about the stars of shows like Preachers of LA? Was this a direct shot at the megachurch pastors with celebrity friends, lavish homes, and flawless social media feeds? The congregation sat frozen, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats, wondering who he was really talking about. The craziest part was how he spoke as if he had been holding these words in for years. His voice rose with passion as he declared that church had turned into a performance, a place where lights and applause mattered more than prayer and humility. When worship becomes a show, he said, people leave entertained, but not transformed. His message hit hard, not only because it was bold, but because it was true. Many in the audience had seen it themselves, pastors becoming celebrities, sermons becoming content, and faith becoming a brand. Some looked down, ashamed, as if these words were personally meant for them. Others whispered, finally, someone is speaking the truth. This was where destiny took an unexpected turn. Fernandez was no stranger to large audiences himself, but he made it clear that his success wasn't his goal. He boldly stated that he would rather be faithful to God than famous in the world. His words cut through the silence like thunder, shocking those who thought he would never dare to go this far. In that moment, he was more than a preacher. He was a voice calling out an entire culture. He stood firm, unbothered by the fact that his words might offend powerful figures. That fearlessness was exactly why his message spread so quickly beyond that single church service. Clips of his sermon began to go viral almost immediately, but even before the videos hit social media, everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something explosive. People were already whispering, "Did you hear what he just said?" as if they couldn't believe a respected bishop had been this bold. The tension in the air wasn't just from what he had said, it was from what he hadn't said. There were no names mentioned, but every person listening was filling in the blanks. And that was the brilliance of it. He didn't need to accuse anyone directly. His words were strong enough to make everyone look at the pastors they followed and ask, is this what church is supposed to be? The storm around Bishop Henry Fernandez's fiery words began spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. Within hours of that powerful sermon, small clips were circulating across Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. The world had just witnessed something they didn't see often: a respected bishop openly challenging the culture of fame within the church. And let me tell you, it wasn't just a discussion anymore. It was turning into a movement. People from different cities, countries, and denominations were watching the video and leaving thousands of comments. Finally, someone said it, some wrote. Others warned that Fernandez was dividing the body of Christ. This is where it got interesting. The debate was no longer about one man's opinion. It was about whether modern ministry had lost its way entirely. Supporters rallied around Fernandez's courage, saying they had been silently feeling uneasy about the direction of the church for years but didn't have the voice to speak up. "This man just said what's been on my heart," one commenter said as the video gained hundreds of thousands of views. Some even called him a prophet for our generation, a man not afraid to stand against a system that seemed untouchable. Many viewers referenced scandals and controversies from recent years, stories of pastors living in mansions worth millions, preachers flying private jets while their congregations struggled to pay rent, and churches turning into entertainment hubs instead of spiritual homes. Fernandez's words felt like a direct challenge to these stories, and his boldness made people feel like a change was finally coming. But here is the shocking part. Not everyone saw him as a hero. In fact, for every supporter praising his bravery, there was another person criticizing him. Some accused him of jealousy, saying that he too had built a large platform and benefited from fame. They argued that he wasn't any different from the pastors he criticized. Others said his message could discourage young believers who admired modern pastors and saw them as role models. "Why tear each other down when the world is already against us?" one person commented. And that wasn't all. Defenders of celebrity pastors came out in full force. Fans of major names like T.D. Jakes and Joel Osteen argued that influence wasn't a sin, and reaching millions of people through media was actually proof of God's blessing. Soon, subtle responses started appearing from some well-known pastors themselves. One pastor posted a cryptic message on social media: "When people throw stones, it usually means you're building something worth noticing." Another delivered a sermon on jealousy in the kingdom, hinting that some leaders tear others down because they're intimidated by success. Though none of these pastors mentioned Fernandez by name, their timing was too perfect to ignore. Listeners connected the dots, sparking even more speculation and drama. The craziest part was that this back and forth only fueled the controversy, making Fernandez's message spread further. As days passed, blogs and Christian news outlets picked up the story. Memes and hashtags started trending, turning Fernandez's fiery remarks into a viral tag. Suddenly, he wasn't just a preacher who gave a sermon. He had become the center of a national conversation about the future of the church. People couldn't stop debating whether his comments were a necessary wake-up call or a dangerous attack on the leaders. Some even started questioning their own pastors and churches, wondering if the stage, lights, and image had overshadowed the true message of faith. Destiny took an unexpected turn when mainstream media outlets began covering the story. They framed it as a battle between tradition and modernity, asking whether churches had become entertainment platforms instead of places of worship. Fernandez had become a lightning rod for both criticism and praise. While some called him brave, others said he had crossed the line. Yet through all the chaos, one thing was clear. His words had forced everyone, leaders and followers alike, to stop and reflect on what was happening inside the church. And that was only the beginning, because what people didn't realize yet was that Fernandez's boldness was tied to something deeper, a storm that had been brewing for years, waiting for the right voice to call it out. To understand why Bishop Henry Fernandez's words struck so deeply, people had to step back and look at the bigger picture. This controversy didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't just one sermon that sparked outrage. It was the breaking point of years of scandals, cultural shifts, and a slow transformation of the church into something unrecognizable to many believers. Let me tell you, Fernandez's timing was no accident. The tension had been building for more than a decade, and when he finally spoke, it felt like a dam had burst. The church world had been rocked by one headline after another. Stories of pastors living in multi-million-dollar mansions while members of their congregations struggled financially had left many questioning the motives of spiritual leaders. There were reports of ministers using church offerings to fund lavish vacations, luxury cars, and private jets. Moral scandals followed, leaders caught in affairs, secret lives exposed, abuse of power uncovered. For many believers, the trust they had in their pastors was slowly breaking. These weren't isolated stories, they were patterns spreading across denominations and continents. And here is the shocking part. Each new scandal made the church look less like a spiritual refuge and more like a stage for fame and fortune. This is where it gets interesting. At the same time these scandals unfolded, a new trend was rising. Reality TV-style churches. Shows like Preachers of LA blurred the line between ministry and entertainment, bringing the private lives of pastors into the spotlight. Viewers tuned in to see the drama, the expensive suits, the exotic cars, and the conflicts between leaders. Some people loved it, calling it refreshing and relatable. Others were outraged, saying it mocked what was meant to be sacred. These shows made pastors celebrities, turning their every word into content for fans to consume. Suddenly, faith felt like another brand, and ministry was starting to look like Hollywood. Fernandez, known for his old-school approach to ministry, saw this shift as dangerous. He believed pastors should be shepherds, not stars. His warning was clear. When worship becomes entertainment, people leave church feeling good, but spiritually empty. He wasn't the only one who noticed this, but few had dared to say it so openly. What made this story different was the weight of Fernandez's reputation. He wasn't a bitter critic throwing stones from the outside. He was someone who had built a respected ministry over decades. That gave his words power, and people knew he wasn't just speaking from frustration. He was speaking from experience. The craziest part was that even as churches grew larger and their influence expanded, Fernandez argued they were losing depth. Attendance numbers looked impressive, but spiritual growth was shallow. Many Christians had begun to see their pastors as influencers first and spiritual leaders second. Churches started resembling corporations with marketing teams and branding strategies, and the focus shifted from saving souls to selling tickets to events. This is not ministry, Fernandez said passionately. This is performance. And that statement hit people hard because they could see it for themselves every Sunday. The flashing lights, the concert-style music, and the constant push for donations that felt more like business than worship. Destiny took another unexpected turn when Fernandez's message started opening old wounds. Believers began sharing personal experiences of being hurt or disappointed by churches that prioritize image over integrity. Some talked about leaving congregations that felt more like entertainment venues than houses of prayer. Others admitted they had been drawn to churches for the wrong reasons, the hype, the luxury, the personality of the pastor, only to walk away feeling empty. Fernandez's sermon was not just calling out pastors, it was forcing people to reflect on themselves, too. That was part of its power. And yet, there was an even deeper layer to this controversy. People began to realize that this wasn't just about a few flashy pastors or a handful of reality shows. It was about the soul of the modern church. Could a faith built on humility survive in a culture obsessed with fame? Could pastors resist the temptation of power and popularity when platforms and audiences rewarded them for it? These were uncomfortable questions that no one wanted to ask, but Fernandez made them unavoidable. His words were like a mirror showing the church what it had become. As this debate spread, people started to wonder about Fernandez himself. Why did he choose this moment to speak? What pushed him over the edge? Was there a scandal we didn't know about? Or had he simply reached a breaking point watching the church drift further from its mission? Whatever the reason, one thing was clear. This was no random outburst. The firestorm surrounding Bishop Henry Fernandez's bold sermon showed no signs of slowing down. What had started as a single message delivered from a pulpit had now become a worldwide conversation. Social media platforms buzzed with heated debates, podcasts dissected his words, and news outlets framed it as a turning point for modern Christianity. Let me tell you, this wasn't just controversy anymore. It was a wake-up call that was forcing believers everywhere to examine their faith. Clips of Fernandez's speech were being shared with captions like "Truth at Last" or "This is why people are leaving the church." But here's the shocking part. Some people weren't just agreeing with him. They were actually leaving churches they felt were more like entertainment venues than places of worship. This is where it gets interesting. Pastors who had once been untouchable were now being questioned by their congregations. Conversations started happening in small Bible study groups, online forums, and even in church hallways. People were asking hard questions. Was their church truly focused on the gospel, or had it become a brand? Were their leaders shepherds, or were they celebrities? These questions shook pastors who had built their ministries on flashy presentations, expensive productions, and constant publicity. Suddenly, the spotlight that had once made them popular was making them vulnerable. Fernandez's message wasn't just words anymore, it was action. And then came the craziest part. Fernandez himself remained calm while the world argued about his sermon. He wasn't posting defensive comments or responding to critics. He wasn't doing interviews to justify his statements. He simply let his words speak for themselves. While pastors and influencers debated his motives, Fernandez kept preaching the same message, that the church had to return to its roots. Some saw this as proof that his intentions were pure. Others believed it was a calculated way to keep the attention on him. Whatever the case, his silence only added fuel to the fire. Destiny took an unexpected turn as the controversy reached leaders far outside Fernandez's circle. Prominent Christian figures, theologians, and authors began weighing in, some praising him as a necessary voice for reform, others condemning him for public criticism of fellow pastors. This was no longer just a church debate. It was a global discussion about what Christianity should look like in the 21st century. Secular media outlets also picked up the story, often twisting it into a narrative of church corruption, adding more pressure on pastors to defend themselves. For some leaders, the easiest way to respond was to stay silent, while others doubled down on defending their ministries. But what makes this story different is how it left no one untouched. Followers who had once idolized celebrity pastors were now rethinking their faith. Churches that had relied on showmanship to draw crowds were questioning whether they had sacrificed substance for style. Even Fernandez's own supporters were challenged to look at themselves and their expectations of church. The debate wasn't just about pointing fingers, it was about uncovering the truth of what worship was meant to be. And that was the real reason his words struck so deeply. By now, weeks had passed, yet the buzz hadn't faded. Everywhere you looked, the conversation continued. Some predicted that Fernandez's message would lead to a spiritual revival, a call back to humility and holiness. Others thought it would cause even more division in a time when churches desperately needed unity. But regardless of opinions, no one could deny that something had shifted. Fernandez's sermon was no longer just a sermon, it had become a defining moment. Let me tell you, this story didn't end with applause or resolution. It ended with a mirror being held up to the church, forcing every believer to decide where they stood. Were they drawn to the lights and fame or to the quiet truth of faith? Were their leaders pointing them to God or to themselves? And that was the tension Fernandez wanted to create. Because sometimes the only way to spark change is to make people uncomfortable. So as Fernandez's fiery words continued to echo across social media feeds and Sunday morning pulpits, one truth became clear. The church had reached a crossroads. The question wasn't just about Fernandez or celebrity pastors anymore. The question was about the soul of modern Christianity. And whether people agreed with him or not, Fernandez had forced the world to stop and think. The storm he started wasn't going away anytime soon, because it wasn't just about one man's opinion. It was about a movement, one that had only just begun.